You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast.
How do we create things that our kids can watch and be more acquainted with the African culture, African history, and even know a bit about Africa? How do we even create authentic African stories? We've watched a lot of predominantly Western content. Not much is being created for an African perspective. How do I unlock the African consciousness, not just for Africans in Nigeria, but also around the world and in diaspora as well? We pretty much had to create our talent and also the business around the opportunity that we're trying to pursue. Everyone is saying, okay, guys, how do we help African stories get to the end of the world? The age of Africa is coming.
Stay tuned as we bring you inspiring people who are unlocking Africa's economic potential. You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast with your host, Tessa Adamu.
Welcome to the Unlocking Africa podcast, where we find amazing people who are doing amazing things to unlock Africa's economic potential. Today, we have another special guest. We have Ferdy Adimefe, who is the founder and CEO of Magic Carpet Studio, an innovation storytelling company committed to transforming the human consciousness by putting authentic African stories on the map. Welcome to the podcast, Ferdy. How are you?
Thanks, fine. Glad to be here. We're really excited about this and what you're doing. So happy to be part of it.
I'm really excited to get into this conversation because your story and what you do, it's very unique. And you are the first animator, creator that we've had on the podcast. So I'm anticipating a very engaging and interesting conversation. But before we start, as always, please introduce yourself and tell us a bit more about Ferdy.
So Ferdy Adimefe is my name. I'm a Nigerian. I'm in my 30s. And about 7 years ago, we started the idea of creating an animation studio here in Lagos. At the time, I had worked for an ad agency, and I noticed a particular pattern that in the ad agency space, people were looking to create something new and different, but we couldn't find a lot of studios or a lot of people who could do global or quality work. I also now pivoted into oil and gas for a bit, where I did brand management. And I had an opportunity to see inside the companies as well, looking for ways to tell creative stories for our brand, and we couldn't find that. So when Magic Carpet started, our commitment was just looking at how we can create an opportunity for brands and for companies to tell stories. But it quickly evolved, and our passion for storytelling and movies started to catch up with us. I read a lot of African literature growing up. Way back, we used to have this African writers series. My mom was a teacher. She's retired now. And she would come home with lots of books. And I remember just even sitting back to read them. I read a lot of them by Chinua Achebe, Wale. And I kind of was very introduced or soaked into the culture. So we sat down in the office one day and we're talking about, okay, we're creating animation for brands, but what about creating it for movies? How do we create things that our kids can watch and be more acquainted with the African culture, African history, and even maybe somehow know a bit about Africa? And then how do we even create authentic African stories? We've watched a lot of things growing up. My kids still watch predominantly white content, Western content. Not very much is being created from an African perspective. And I think there's an opportunity there which Magic Carpet was created to meet. I'm married with 3 kids, right? So that means I get to experience life through the eyes of my kids. And as a father and also a creator and a writer, my passion has always been, how do I come alongside them to create things that will enrich their understanding about their identity, their history, and their culture? How do I unlock the African consciousness, not just for Africans in Nigeria, but also around the world and in diaspora as well?
Awesome. So you've given us a overview of your diverse background, how and when you started the company about, was it 7 years ago?
Yes, about 7 years ago.
And you realized there was a gap in the market, and also your love for African literature, which is something I am extremely impressed by because we've had previous conversations as well, and we seem to share similar passion for African literature. So I was wondering, since you started the company 7 years ago, how has it evolved over that time?
I think that it has evolved very well. So far, we have over 50 people, 50 animators, and about 5 writers part of the team. So we have evolved beyond just a traditional studio where we were doing mostly 2D traditional animation. We now have a team that does 3D animation, and we also have a team doing 2D cutout animation. So these are different styles of animation. We also have a very robust training side of the business. Because in Nigeria currently, no university offers animation. And for you to find an animator, you have to train them. So we go around getting students from technical colleges. We engage them for about a year, and then we put them on production. So we pretty much had to create our talent and also the business around the opportunity that we're trying to pursue, because capacity is very important in animation. Apart from growing to other forms of animation, we've also grown to even more define our ideas of what we want to tell. So we have about 3 projects in production. The first project is The Passport of Malam Ilya. Now, it's very interesting how we came about this project, because it was first a novel written in 1960 by Cipra Lequency, who is now late. So we asked everyone in the office that, come to think of it, we read books growing up. Which of this novel would you like to see brought to the big screen as film? And everybody was very excited. Names were just flying around. And then somebody mentioned Passport of Madame Ilya. It rang a bell for me, because even when I read it as a kid, I remember it was very cinematic. And I thought, okay, it'd be nice to go back and read this again and see what it looks like. And so we decided we're going to check it out. We did. And then a week after, we came back into the studio and we're ready. Everybody was like, it is Passport of Madame Ilya. That's the one we want to tell. And it was so exciting just listening to everybody talk about their experience reading the book. We started the production about 2 years ago. We're currently in the middle of a production. The film will be ready by 2024, first quarter. So hopefully you can see it around the world, and even your audience as well can check it out. It's a very interesting story that's spread across 3 countries. There is Nigeria, Cameroon, and Saudi Arabia. But this was 19th century Kano. It was way back before the terrorism era. So Kano was pretty much an ancient empire.
Yes.
And it was also the colonial invasion. So you find the tension that played out in Kano at the time of the colonial invasion. We also find that at this time, there were really, really warriors in the land. People fought to survive. It was pretty much survival of the fittest. So it was pretty much a very, very Western story in a sense: conquest, love, betrayal. And we thought it was a recipe for a great story that could really rival a lot of the international stories. And so we've been excited in that process to bring it to the world. The second project we started as well is a family series, right? It's a cutout series. Cutout is interesting because it's a faster way to produce. And then for us, we wanted to create something that can show the world about the authentic African family. Again, most of us grew up with very, very interesting religious moms. Africans, we can be very religious.
Yes.
Fathers who are very passionate about your success than you, right? Parents who are just living vicariously through their children, and most times vested in your success, and they feel your pain even when you fail, agonizing over it. And there's a flip side that in the way the African setup is made, a lot of families experience conditional love. Most of our parents will not tell you it's conditional, but it was almost the way you were successful, you would get more love when you succeed. I mean, if you come back home with good grades, they'll love you. It was just the way it was. The typical African child, sometimes we grew up very, very addicted to success. We are traumatized by failure. We don't understand that failure is a process to learning.
Yes.
It's pretty much almost an indictment on your self-worth. So I think it plays out in a way that now we talk about mental health, and you find a lot of young millennials and Gen Z going through serious, intense mental health battle because they've never unlearned the way they were raised in terms of just conditioning their world around being approved by people's opinion or by their parental opinion. And I think that what we're doing with this series is just to give a bit of it's a comical series, but there are deep things there. We're hoping to unravel for many families what it means for the kind of patterns that we were raised with, in hope that people would find conversations around the dinner table of how to heal as families and develop a more unconditional way of raising our kids that is not going to be performance-driven, but loving them for who they are and accepting the kids for who they are, providing the environment for every kid to thrive and truly flourish in their own unique personalities. Right. And so that's what we're trying to do. It's called Meet the Igwes. We're getting a pilot out next year, first quarter. We also have another interesting series called The Legends of Bulan. Now, Bulan is the name for Africa before it was called Africa. And it was initially called Akebulan. So we created this interesting series. It's a Pan-African project. So we're going to be working with writers from across Africa, all the way from Ashanti in Ghana to Zulu in South Africa. So the idea is we're bringing back these legends and these heroes into a timeline and then creating this beautiful world where we're asking our audiences, what if Africa was never colonized? What type of civilization would Africa be? And through this series, we want to give the world a snapshot of the ancient civilization, the world before the colonial era in Africa, and just even run a parallel universe where Africa would be unique and distinct. So I think that's pretty much where we are with that particular project.
Beautiful, beautiful. So you've detailed how the company has grown and you now have 50 animators and writers, and also your training and development program that you run in-house, and how you're also refining your ideas and telling the African story, which is something that you specialize in. Was it always the plan from the start to focus on telling the African story, and why?
Well, it wasn't always the plan. It grew up on us.
Okay.
It actually grew up on us. And I think for me, when it comes to on-screen representation of African stories, we are not doing a lot in that area. The animation industry, Africa contributes for less than 4% of that industry. But then in terms of the population, Africa is the birth center of the world. We have about 1.3 billion people. And then when you look at the population of Africans who live even outside the continent, it's significant. But we've not been intentional about bringing our stories to life. So it kind of grew on us. Interestingly, because I'm very much given to studying the world and a little bit of a philosopher some days, I tend to pay attention to patterns, to culture, to history. And I also have a co-founder who is vested in the African spirituality and African consciousness. And we have conversations about the colonization of the African mind, our type of spirituality also being very outsourced, rather than going back in the world where the African spirituality we're raised with, or we knew from our ancient times, from our ancestors, were pretty much a very, very in situ reality where for them, they felt a certain type of connectedness where it was an eternal reality. It was pretty much a unique way of interpreting the world through their heartbeat, through their breath, and connecting with culture, with sound, with nature. That Africa was very, very spiritual. But again, when religion came in, there was a sense that we lost the baby and the bathwater. And in practicing the Christian religion on many fronts, we didn't quite retain what I would call harmless. We basically just jettisoned everything that looked diabolical, everything that was even culture. And so for a new generation of people, we're asking ourselves the contradiction that many of us are facing being raised in Africa, where we are deeply religious but deeply corrupt on many fronts. Could it possibly be that we are not being authentic, even because we seem uprooted from our own sense of culture, our own sense of being? All of these things started to shape our conversation, even when it comes to politics, how we are governed, the type of leadership we're subjected to, the conditioned mind that doesn't question, that is not very interested in challenging the status quo. And we actually started to see the potency of art, that through storytelling, you can put ideas in the world. And that's part of why we describe Magic Carpet as an innovation storytelling company, because we feel like as we evolve, new tools for telling stories will come. The medium will change, but fundamentally the stories will remain. So we want to approach it as story first. And every story we want to tell, our commitment is to bring that story to its full potential.
You've raised some extremely interesting points. One thing that you did mention is that telling the African story wasn't always your plan. So from your perspective, why are stories important? Why is it important for Africa to tell its own story? And what are the risks of allowing other people to tell our story?
I think that when our stories are told for us, we may not have our perspective registered. So in a sense, we're coming through years of from slavery to colonialism. All of these things have somehow disempowered us in a sense. So the typical African mind is oftentimes a spectator, even in his own history. He's not a participant. And I think that we need to really remind ourselves that we have lived through years of interesting evolution. We've lived through years of both economic, political, social, cultural evolution. And currently, we're coming to a world that is yearning to experience Africa. And that opportunity for us, it's why Africans have to own how the stories are told. We missed out on Industrial Revolution, but I think the next revolution that we're moving into is going to be driven by storytelling. And is what I call sort of like a type of cultural revolution that will be powered by how stories are told, right? And it's African stories will really be at the forefront. If you've paid attention recently, from Woman King to Black Panther, everyone is looking to this exciting renaissance of the African consciousness, African taste, African culture, history, even Afrobeat music. They're gaining ascendance across the world with African artists topping the billboards. And that's actually something to be said, that the age of Africa is coming. And if we don't participate in these stories and how they are told, we may lose out again. It's important for us to then bring our writers to the table and then sponsor and support everyone who is at the forefront of creating the stories as experts. There is also a part of it where, for instance, Disney just acquired a comic series belonging to some Nigerians called Iwaju. That series is coming out next year. Then HBO just also acquired another one called Yanu. Now, if you look at those stories, when they are acquired and developed, you realize that the way an African director, an African animator would approach the story is going to be very different from the way the big companies would approach it when they are told. And I think for us, we really think that there is a place to really lean in and then feel the heartbeat of the continent. And, from our legends to our myth and mythology, our empires and emperors, and the reservoirs of stories that we were raised with, they can make epic series, they can become massive feature films, but it's important because whoever tells the story shapes the civilization. And I think for us, we want to contribute to how the world evolves to a more human-centered world that allows for, Africans are more communal than individualistic, right? Just bringing us back to certain type of culture, certain types of attributes that the world needs even now. So I think it's our time to contribute. The Greek mythology or the Norse mythology, a lot of those stories have been explored very, very well. But if you look at the difference between Thor and Shango, it's pretty much the same type of personality in a sense, but Shango has remained frozen in the past and not really brought into the world of storytelling. So that's part of why I think we need to tell stories. In telling our stories, the world will understand Africans better, and we can understand the world even better. And I think more importantly, in telling our stories, we're also creating the industry and the economy around that, which would impact on job creation, which will impact on the next generation that we are being raised to be more comfortable in who they are, in our identity, in our history, in our culture. And this sense of rootedness is also very, very strong in the Magic Carpet mission statement.
So you've detailed the importance of Africans telling their own story, also the increase of African stories being told, such as Black Panthers, but you also made a mention of the difference of how African stories are told if they are told by Africans and not by Western productions. So I was wondering, have you noticed an increase in actual Africans wanting to tell the African story?
Yes, that increase is really here in Lagos and pretty much across Africa. But again, because in a sense, most of the funds required to drive African storytelling will come from a combination of grants. And the reason why that is because there's not a lot of data when it comes to it. They're still very much in the pioneering stages or in the formative stages. So investors, whether it's PE firms or venture capitalists, tend to ask questions: how many African blockbusters have been produced and how did they perform, right? What was the budget? The cost of producing an animated movie is very, very high. And in Africa, particularly in Nigeria here, intellectual properties are not necessarily recognized as collateral. So for you to get funding, you need to really, really think very creatively on how you can basically approach that. So while there are a lot of people willing to tell the stories, the funding to tell that story is still not there yet. I think that is one of the challenges. But yes, there is a growing number of young Africans who are really committed to bringing the stories to life.
Oh, that's great to hear. That's great to hear. But obviously, you mentioned in terms of the cost of producing African animations is really, really high. So I guess that might have an impact in terms of the growth of the industry. So I was wondering, how has the Nigerian or African animation industry evolved or grown since you've been involved?
Oh, it's growing, actually. We have quite a number of studios now coming up. a lot of people are getting more interested in pursuing a career in animation. We now have the Comic-Con in Lagos.
Oh, brilliant.
I'm part of a community of people putting together a huge creative African fest. And then animation is now going to be a major one that will be highlighted during that period. So we're getting that recognition. This year, as a studio, we participated in the second biggest animation festival in the world, which is the Annecy Film Festival. And we were really, really well received by the international community who came around to see, oh, there's an African studio here doing amazing work. So the space is growing, the interest is growing. And also, I'm being invited from African Development Bank to Bank of Industry to Afrexim Bank. Everyone is saying, okay, guys, how do we help African stories get to the end of the world? How do we structure the capital and the access to those funds? Because it requires a very peculiar way of approaching it. Both from the capital side, the conversation is now getting even more sophisticated, and even the industry events are becoming more frequent. And I'm sure all of these things are coming together rightly so as a perfect mix for what will become the growth of the industry.
Fantastic. Earlier on, you mentioned the lack of formal animation education in Africa and also the lack of funding available. Outside of those two areas, what are some of the other challenges that you've encountered building, say, a creative tech empire for African storytelling?
So I think that just even operating a business in Africa, and particularly in a place like Nigeria, can be challenging because of some infrastructural issues that we contend with. We know that the cost of power is relatively high. You have to rely on generators sometimes to keep your business going. That's also part of it. You live in a space that can also be pretty much challenging around the cultural limitation. But I really always feel like all of these things that are part of the challenge is exactly why we thrive as a company or as a people. Access to capital has been the issue. The infrastructural challenges has been the issue. There's also a sense that a lot of the foreign companies just don't necessarily trust Africa for quality production yet. So as a company, we recently got a gig with Cartoon Network, working with a national company, Cartoon Network and Warner Brothers. So just working with them, we saw that at first they were very, very suspicious as to whether this would go well. And then before long, they were very excited about what they were seeing. And then, of course, I'm sure that they got a good deal, because if they were going to produce outside of Africa, it would be way more expensive. So in a sense, just that trust factor, we as a company were changing it, because the only way you can change that is to produce and to deliver on the projects that are given to us as a country and as a company. Because when we get it right, it opens up the possibilities for every other African studio. And I think that's our commitment and what we're working towards. So that trust factor, we are committed to helping the world discover that they're honest, hardworking businessmen here in Nigeria. Amidst all the challenges and the limitation that we are grappling with, we still remain true to our calling and true to our mission to deliver world-class stories, both for our clients and for ourselves.
So you've detailed some of the challenges such as access to capital, infrastructure challenges, and the lack of trust or the trust factor from potential partners outside of Africa. So you are a creative business, so you do need to be profitable. So what is the economic side of this industry? Is there enough opportunity in Africa for you to scale and become hugely profitable?
There is actually a market for Africans. But again, animation is an export. So in as much as we have a significant market in Africa, you also need to find a way to access the international market with distribution. And that is one way we can actually succeed what we're doing. I think for us, it's pretty much what I've actually seen. There is a big market. There is still the part of the market where, because there is not a lot of content being produced due to not enough access to capital, people don't even know yet. But I'm sure that once we deliver the first two projects and it opens up, you will realize that everyone will be excited in backing an animation project. Animation movies hardly make a loss.
Yes.
Right? So you're already certain that, yes, the cost of production of an animation movie is expensive because there is not enough cinema in Nigeria alone to be able to recoup. So you need to integrate across Africa, both Francophone and Anglophone country. And I think there's also a challenge in that area. Between Nigeria and Ghana, and even between Ghana and South Africa or Rwanda and Kenya, there is a need for us as a continent to even begin to do business amongst ourselves.
Yes.
We cannot unlock the potential of Africa if we don't learn to work together. And we have very weak co-production arrangements or bilateral trade arrangement that can create opportunities for capital to come together to scale up the projects. Because a lot of the other smaller African countries cannot significantly by themselves execute a project and break even. They need Nigeria. Nigeria themselves cannot execute alone without working with other countries. So to get products like animation scaling, you need to get the African Trade Agreement functional, where Africans can also now become an integrated economic hub. Africans can now begin to co-produce together. We can allow for the free flow of goods and services even amongst our countries. We can respect our IPs and give other African countries a fair landing, even in different countries as you go across. And I think a need for education, a need for enlightenment, a need for informing Africans in that direction needs to happen to get that working. But I think that is where I am suspecting we might need to pay more attention.
Thank you for that, Ferdy. So you detailed that there is a big and growing market and also the need to integrate across Africa to maximize the commercial value of your films or just the film industry or the African film industry in general. I think in Africa, sometimes we don't fully appreciate the commercial value of, say, owning our own story and content, which is something that we've discussed at length today. So I was wondering, what are some of the ways that you're using to monetize what you do in terms of the ownership of your stories that you're telling?
Okay, in terms of monetizing our stories, quite frankly, you can only monetize when you've completed your production. So we have 2 short films that we've released on YouTube. And those 2 short films, our YouTube channel is monetized. So it gets to make money every now and again. But one of the significant way we've been able to keep our studio running, it's a hybrid. So we don't just produce for ourselves, we also produce for other studios like Cartoon Network and Warner Brothers that we're working with now. We do a lot of agency work with brands across Nigeria, from the big telecoms to the bank, to the fintechs, to just help them use the medium of animation to connect with their audiences. That's basically one of the ways we've been able to sustain and grow the studio. But in a more sustainable way would really be about really stabilizing or creating access to capital to produce film and export, because every completed movie is a digital real estate, and you keep earning for that movie for the rest of your life. I mean, the movie can be licensed to Asia, licensed to any other parts of the world, and it's really, really exciting when those things are done. So we're very committed that that's a bigger deal, but in the short term, we take on jobs to keep the lights on and to keep growing. We also do a lot of training. Training, again, becomes expensive because a lot of Africans who are interested may not be able to afford the system, the computers, or the equipment that is required. So what we tend to do is we tend to look for partners. We did one with the UNDP recently, where we got about 30 people from across Africa to be trained in Lagos in the field of animation. And it was sort of like a train the trainer.
Yes.
And our plan is, as they go back to their countries, they would also over time set up training centers, and we can work with them to help scale that. For us to be able to deliver on the stories, we need capacity, not just in Nigeria, across Africa. And animation holds a very significant promise in helping scale up jobs and also bringing the continent together because of the nature of animation. To complete one animation project, you might need about 2,000 people working across different time zones. That's how interesting animation can be. And I think that is an opportunity for Africans to begin to come back to that interconnectedness, that Ubuntu spirit of oneness, because this project requires that.
Awesome. So you detailed there your work with large organizations such as Cartoon Network, Warner Brothers, and some of the private brands that you work with, and also the importance of animation in Africa. I guess we're seeing how African animation is slowly starting to be recognized and seen as quite important within the animation space globally, which has seen Magic Carpet Studio recently win some awards. So I was wondering, what have these awards done for the profile of the company?
They've given us a lot of international recognition. And having won those awards, it's also a testament that Africans can also do the same thing. We can produce stories. Most of these awards are short films, but if you can do it for a short film with the right funding, you can definitely deliver that for a feature film. And so the world is now not just giving us the attention, but also become even more attracted to working with us. We're currently in different conversations with a potential co-production arrangement with some studios in Europe. And I think it's because these awards are there to show, and the quality of our work is also there to validate that the time of African storytelling has come, and that they would also benefit immensely by working with us. And so these awards are opening doors from one place to another, opening doors for partnership, hopefully will also open doors for funding on a larger scale.
As we know, animation is a relatively new space in Africa, and not a lot of people realize that you can make a career from it. From someone who is embedded in the animation space, what's your advice to young people in Africa looking to start a career in animation?
Well, I think a career in animation is a very promising one. One, because you would hardly ever be out of job. There are many platforms that are coming now, from Hulu to Amazon Prime to Netflix. Everyone is looking for content. And animation is a significant part of this niche. And there is not enough animators, right, to even execute on projects. I mean, companies like Disney, they have production slates for 10 years ahead, and they don't have enough people to deliver on them. So the only reason why they're not working on those production yet is because they don't have the capacity, or they've not found studios with the capacity to deliver on those projects. So Africans can attract those jobs. Africans can bring them here, and Africans can deliver on those jobs. And I think that's my desire for the country and the continent.
Awesome, awesome. So you mentioned there are not enough animators in Africa and globally, and you could see a lot more studios or companies based in the US or Europe looking towards Africa to work with African animators. So how do the skills of African animators that you've worked with compare to the global counterparts?
I think it's very impressive. That impressive is the word. Even our art directors, most of them are also have been approached by foreign studios to consider working on their projects as well. So that's actually very, very interesting, because, I mean, one of the short films we released, SEEP, I remember one of the comments we got, the guy said to us, I was so impressed looking at all the names, and I was seeing Chekube, Dauda.
Yes.
And it was like, wow, these guys are all based in Lagos. I said, yes, it's all in Lagos, and it's being created from here. So that is, we're impressed with the quality we're putting out, and the world is also impressed with it, and it's catching on really quick. And I think kudos to all the amazing animators out there who are giving their best and putting quality work out there. And I think it's not just a win for them, it's a win for the continent.
Awesome, awesome. So you mentioned the skills of African animators and the potential for African animators to work within Africa and also outside of Africa. So when we look outside of, say, animators specifically as a person and look at the studios, when you're working with foreign companies based in, say, the US or Europe, what challenges in terms of licensing African animations to the likes of, say, Disney or Netflix?
Well, I think it's been very challenging, one, because they don't necessarily have a mandate for animation among the acquisition team focused in Africa. And because for them, they don't think that there is enough content produced to attract that. So if you're an animation studio trying to get a distribution deal, you might want to consider operating from other regions in Europe to be able to get access to distributors and at least get the fair value for what you're producing. But I'm hoping that as the conversation evolves, that even from Netflix to Amazon, they'll become even more aware of the need for us to, as much as possible, bring that mandate here and support the growth of the industry, even in Africa. Because if Africa is not on the map, it's not a map.
I like that. If Africa is not on the map, it's not a map. Very, very true. We are seeing increased amounts of interest in Africa, whether it's African startups in the fintech industry. Are you seeing the same level of interest in the creative industry in terms of investors looking to invest in what you're doing?
We're seeing attention, but we're not seeing a lot of conversion, right? So they reach out every now and again. Everyone is just curious. But like I said, we've been fortunate enough to at least design for ourselves what will help us in accessing funding. So unlike fintech is very mature in Nigeria. A lot of fintechs, I mean, you have some of them that are already unicorns within a space of 7 to 10 years. And I think animation can become the next fintech with the right site of funding, with the right injection of capital and the developmental space for talent. You definitely are on your way to creating unicorns, even with the animation space or even in the animation space.
Interesting. You mentioned there that you are seeing interest, but not the level of conversion. What do you think is stopping the conversion? Is it a lack of data, understanding, or knowledge from the investor's side?
I think it's generally a lack of understanding and data for the space. And again, it comes with nascent or formative industries that are just emerging. Investors tend to be reticent, and oftentimes they tend to take a wait and see approach as things unfold. So I think that's where the industry has been, but that's changing. We're seeing a lot of institutional funding that is now being thrown into Africa. And hopefully by next year, a lot of studios can start accessing those funds from training to production. I mean, those funds are already coming in, but I don't know of many studios now that can say we now have it. But I mean, today we even had a conversation with an organization that just set up fund for the creative space. There's a need for a lot of understanding, consultation to be able to help. One of the other things that is also not helping out, like I said, is because when it comes to animation, the cost of production is high. So you have to co-produce with studios from other countries. And very many African countries do not have bilateral trade agreements, not even amongst themselves, much less amongst other developed countries. There's a bit of policy direction there where governments have to work towards engaging that environment where co-production can be possible, where their creators and animators and directors and storytellers can work through partnership to deliver great projects.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Ferdy. So you mentioned it's early days and sometimes the data and knowledge is not always available for investors to make informed decision when deciding to invest in, say, animations or the creative industry in Africa, Nigeria specifically. But hopefully this should change in the not so distant future. So looking at the future, for you, what does the future look like for creatives in Nigeria in practical terms? Can the creative industry help the economic growth of a market such as Nigeria?
Very well. And I think that if you've paid attention, for many people who have, we're seeing that the greatest potential for job creation will be within the creative space, not even in traditional sectors. So we know that we need to get the creative industry right. As the Nigerian government is transitioning, we're hoping that the incoming administration would have policies or framework to map out and fund the creative sector to help drive growth. With the youthful population we have, is a creative population. And I think that the raw material is there. What we have missing is just the right policy to unlock it, the right partnerships to unlock it. And I'm looking at a very bright future for the creatives in Africa. It's already happening in the music space,
yes,
where African music artists are now having to collaborate with foreign artists. In the past, it used to be the other way around. They will reach out to foreign artists and it will take months, if at all, they'll respond. Now they're reaching out to African artists to want to jump in and work with. So it speaks to the resilience and it speaks to the quality and the richness of the African output. And I think that output is not limited to music. It's also in stories, it's also in fashion, it's also in arts, and it's in also many other emerging creative spaces as well.
Awesome. I agree 100%. The creative industry in Africa is the future and it has a very, very strong power in terms of soft power to leverage Africa's position, profile, and promote Africa. So yes, I am a very big believer in the power of Africa's creative industry, arts and culture. So looking at the future in terms of the future of Africa, where do you see Africa's animation industry in 5 years' time?
I see a lot of international studios. I see a lot of them attaining international status. I see them completing and exporting international projects. I see the industry growing to contribute significantly to the GDP in Africa. I think it will triple in the next coming years. In India, for instance, about 25% of their GDP comes from the creative sector and particularly driven by animation.
Oh, wow.
So I personally believe that animation can hold the same capacity here in Africa. Reason again, our population, our ability to be multilingual. We speak at least English and even French. So that gives potential for a lot of possibilities when it comes to the growth of studios internationally.
I like the sound of that. I like the picture that you've painted, and it's one that I definitely look forward to seeing and one that I hope happens. Looking closer to home, where do you see yourself and Magic Carpet Studios in 5 years' time?
Well, what we have in mind is in 5 years' time, we want to be a household name, at least about 5 projects released in the big screen, and very, very rooted as an iconic brand, a cultural iconic brand that every African will be proud to associate with. We want to also be hopefully listed in London Stock Exchange, right?
Brilliant.
To get publicly traded and be beneficial for all our investors who took a chance on us where we needed that belief and faith in what we're doing. And for me, I'm very committed to seeing that not just my team grow and succeed, but even the investors who come alongside us will be also deeply grateful that they took a chance with us.
Awesome. That's a great vision and one I am confident that you will achieve. I'm looking forward to seeing some of your animations on the big screen, so I'm sure it will happen for you.
Thank you very much, Tessa.
Quote of the week.
As people, we often have quotes, mantras, African proverbs, or even affirmations that keep us going when times are challenging and when times are good. Do you have one that you can share with us today?
Yes, I think one that comes to mind is one my mom would oftentimes say is an African proverb that whenever you wake up is your morning, and that when you meet somebody in the afternoon, it's still morning. When you meet somebody in the evening, it can still be morning. That morning is not a time in the day, it's a consciousness. And so that for us, opportunities are not things that we have passed out on. Opportunities are things we create every moment by moment as we move on. And that for us, we have to take responsibility for ourselves and don't resign to faith or don't think what the government is not doing for us, but what can we do with all the limitations we have? How can we rise up and build a continent that we can all be proud of? Whenever you wake up is your morning.
Wow, I like that a lot. Brilliant, and thank you for sharing that with us today, Ferdy. As we're coming to the end of today's conversation, I was hoping you can give us some closing remarks and final call to action for anyone who's interested in African animations or just interested in the work that you do at Magic Carpet Studios.
I think for us as a studio, we're committed to putting Africa on the map. We're committed to increasing the on-screen representation of Black stories, African stories. And that mission is one that I think every African should share because we are connected, is a collective mission. And for us to succeed is to, contribute significantly to the success of the continent, because at the end of the day, storytelling is how people are defined. Every true sense of identity is rooted in the stories we tell about ourselves. And let's tell the stories that can empower us and liberate us forever.
Awesome. Brilliant. What a way to close today's episode. That has been an extremely engaging, innovative, creative conversation. Thank you for joining me today, Ferdy.
Thank you, Tessa. I had fun and very, very interesting questions. Thank you so much for having me again.
Brilliant. I know you're extremely busy running Magic Carpet Studio and your other ventures that you have. So thank you for taking the time out today to join me on the podcast, and look forward to seeing many, many more successes from you in the near future, and look forward to keeping in touch.
Thank you very much, Tessa. Bye.
Thank you to everyone who has listened and stayed tuned to the podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share, or tell a friend about it. You can also rate, review us in Apple Podcasts or wherever you download your podcast. Thank you, and see you next week for the Unlocking Africa podcast.